Today, we are welcoming Kella Hanna-Wayne, who is a disabled activist and writer, the main writer behind the social justice blog Yop at yopvoice.com. She writes educational content meant to equip people to understand all forms of social justice, and also talks a lot about her experiences as a disabled and chronically ill person. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the intersection of chronic illness and disability and sex, and kind of how all those things intertwine. Kella, welcome so much.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into activism? How did you find that that's something you wanted to do?
I kind of fell naturally into activism. I feel like I've kind of always had those tendencies, even like as a little kid. I was just very concerned with what was right and what was just and not hurting people. And so I just kind of fell into it as that came up in my life, as it became relevant. Feminism was one of the first ways that I was exposed to that. And then just gradually finding out about more and more issues, I incorporated more and more of them into my activism. Disability activism came into my life when I became disabled in 2014. And that was a whole new branch that I knew nothing about. And so I just try to incorporate as many different types of activism and as many causes as I can.
Awesome. Wonderful. I've written for Yop, and I've read some of the articles there. It's a great blog, great website. So you should definitely check that out. And we'll have all that information in the description down below at the end of the video. If you are watching and you have a question about disability and chronic illness and sex, feel free to call in. We do have lines open and we are taking calls. The number is 512-686-0279. And we'll be taking calls throughout the broadcast. So I think we'll just jump right in and ask a couple basic questions kind of about chronic illness and disability first, and then move into the sexy parts a little bit after that.
Sure, and as we do, I guess I just kind of wanted to highlight something you said, Kella, which is this idea that feminism was sort of a gateway into this sort of activism. And I don't want to overstress it, but I think it's really interesting and really important to remember that learning how to treat people, as women are and as feminism intends to do, is expansive. That idea, once it germinates, begins to include different races, different orientations, different cultures, people of all different sorts. And I think the opposite is also true. And we're seeing that a lot in our country when we allow a little bit of aggression towards trans folks that begins to erode the rights of queer folks in general, which is, misogyny and homophobia are very closely tied to one another and all of these things. So I just think that that's such an important thing to, I guess, highlight.
Yeah, one of the primary lessons from my writing, my educational material on Yop, is the idea that there are a set of principles in activism that if you follow, you can basically apply them to any type of social justice. That things like our tendency to center the privileged groups, our tendency to scrutinize the action of marginalized people, the way that language comes into things, the lack of awareness of people's problems, all of those things are applicable to basically any social justice cause. And understanding the concept thoroughly helps you apply it to other causes that you are less familiar with.
You hear that, TERFs? Take notes.
Right? Oh my gosh. No, I totally agree. In fact, I remember talking with one of my friends, and they were talking about how it seemed to be a pattern that people discovered that they were not cis, either trans or non-binary, after interacting with feminist groups and in feminist circles, because that's where that kind of comes into play, where that kind of acceptance and discussion kind of happens. So the feminist movement and the trans movement are kind of interlinked in that way. which is fascinating. We can go on about that all night. But kind of coming back to what you were saying about language and how we use language, I think the very first question that I want to get out of the way so that we're making sure that, we're using the right words for things. Are there specific terms that we should be using as a general populace for people who are chronically ill and or disabled? Are there good words? Are there not so good words? Is it an individual basis kind of thing?
Well, everything is always going to have some amount of individual basis that, as with anything, what your personal preferences rules over other things. But on the whole, most people in the disabled community prefer disabled person over person with disabilities. That by and large, they prefer identity first language over person first language. Other words, so obviously there's the extremely more offensive ones that are clearly offensive, like cripple, that you don't want to say. But then there's also some of the more PC words that the disability community doesn't like ultra-abled or special needs or, just differently abled, things like that, that are generally not liked either. Some less known ones, well, handicapped is kind of going out of style. It's kind of outdated at this point. I'm not a bathroom stall or a parking spot.
Right.
And another one a lot of people don't know about is wheelchair bound is not a good phrase to use because people that use wheelchairs, they are not bound to their wheelchairs. Their wheelchairs are the reason that they can move at all. And they are their source of freedom, not their source of constraint. So that's a common one. But in terms of what words you should use, wheelchair user in that case, otherwise just disabled and chronically ill, like it's pretty straightforward that you can use those terms and they are pretty widely applicable.
Okay, good to know. That's very interesting about the wheelchair bound versus wheelchair user, because I also know that a lot of people who use wheelchairs aren't necessarily bound to them 24/7. And
Exactly.
if people see them get up, they're like, what is this? It's like, no, like they are valid tools that these people are using, but it might not be a 24/7 kind of thing. And that's a misconception that I think we need to work on. Okay.
Some other language that comes up a lot in relation to that. Special faker is one that a lot of disabled people hear, and also real disability or really disabled. Those are ones that come up. And then the last one that a term you need to be careful with is calling disabled people inspirational. For me personally, it's just like with being a woman and being considered sexy. It's fine if someone thinks that I'm sexy as long as they think that I'm other things too. As long as they see that that's part of me being a human, part of my other types of competence and skills. But so often disabled people are reduced to just being inspirational and being inspirational for like just existing and just doing normal things. So that's a term that you have to be careful with.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Kind of magic minority thinking the
Yes.
so-called good bigotry, right?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know. That's very helpful, I think. And honestly, we could talk about that all night too. We're going to be jumping around quite a bit and only touching the surface for a lot of these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if at any point you're like, stop, we want to talk about that, just let me know. So I guess I've got a question, kind of seeing both of these terms used often together, sometimes interchangeably. Is there a distinction between disabled versus chronically ill? If you have a chronic illness, are you can you call yourself disabled? Or are there disabilities that wouldn't be considered chronic illnesses?
I think that there is a very large overlap between the two, but that they are two distinct things. I was thinking about this leading up to the show and trying to figure out what the distinction is, because I think there is one, but it's hard to define. I'm sure some of it is identity, some of it is just what you resonate with. But the way that I would describe the difference between disability and chronic illness is that a disability has to do with the structure of the way your body and your mind are made, the way that they are structured and how that interacts with the outside world. That the outside world is not set up for the structure of your body and mind to function easily. Whereas a chronic illness, there's actually a sickness involved. It's about how your body responds to like external stimuli. And so whereas accommodation for a disability usually has to do with the setup you have around you, the physical things you have access to, the tools you have. A chronic illness being accommodated is usually a lot more about medical treatment and like environment and like, and medication or diet or that kind of thing.
Interesting. That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, no, it makes sense because, for instance, somebody who has perhaps had a foot amputated or something along those lines may be in every way healthy. They're not struggling with a chronic illness. However, they might need different accommodations or just not fit into a world that isn't accommodating to those kinds of concerns.
Interesting.
While we're talking about language, I'm certainly not looking to gatekeep, but I'm wondering if there is a distinction or a particular definition of the word disabled that has like a bar attached to it. I mean, if you, for instance, suffer from depression, that is a chronic illness and it can be completely disabling. Is there a magic number, for instance, or just some point at which you become disabled?
I think that disability is a very personal thing in terms of whether you call yourself that. I would say that like objectively, the difference is at what point does it interfere with multiple aspects of your life? And the interesting part of that means that if you are fully accommodated, you become less disabled. And so in theory, the social model of disability is that if you fully accommodate a disability, the disability goes away. That is not the case for all disabilities, but in theory, that's possible for some people.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
all right.
Absolutely.
That was a really good question. Are there any other kind of simple misconceptions, things that people ask you a lot that we can kind of debunk here super quick before we jump into the major portion of the debunking, which is all around sex? Anything that you've come across in your activism as you've interacted with other people who are maybe also disabled and struggling with things that you'd like to just clear the air about?
So my biggest thing with having people that are not familiar with disability to help them understand is that I think that a lot of the able-bodied world, which is the opposite of disabled, looks at disability and frames it in terms of a lack of something, in terms of something not working, in terms of something being broken. And the majority of disabled people don't think of themselves that way. So many disabled people, disability is part of their identity, it's part of who they are, and able people will be like, why would you define yourself by something you can't do? That sounds so depressing. But that's not actually what's happening. That when you identify as disabled, when that's part of who you are talking about the creativity and the adaptation and the innovation and the reinventing things that is required in order to move through the world with a disability, that those are special qualities and skills that you have to have. And that sets you apart from other people, and that enables you to connect with other disabled people in a special way. So if you can look at disability through that lens of people that are adaptive, that are creative, that look at things in a different way that way, rather than in you can't do something, I think that just immediately helps shift everything and helps people connect to disabled people a lot better. The other big thing that I would want to debunk is that there's a really, really strong cultural attitude that it is the responsibility of abled people to assess whether or not someone is disabled and whether or not resources they are using, whatever they are being used appropriately. And first of all, you cannot tell by looking at someone whether or not they are disabled. Just 100%, you cannot tell. And if their disability is visible, like if they're using a wheelchair, even then, you cannot tell to what degree it affects them. You can't tell what their disability is, how it's going to manifest. And you don't have to. There's no reason for you, a stranger, looking at someone who's disabled to be like, what is their disability? What does this mean about them? What should they be using? It's not your business. Like, it has nothing to do with you. And this is just a really, really common thing that people will be like, are you sure you're supposed to be using that? And it's just not your responsibility.
Right. That's a really good point. Any other questions you've got?
No, not along those lines. I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of people who have disabilities, people who really have any kind of different experience, don't need outside validation from us. I mean, as human beings, we all crave validation. We all crave to be seen. But unless somebody is asking you for that, there's no need to step in and talk to a stranger about whether or not their identity conforms with how you think it should be.
Right. Just general rule of thumb. That's probably a good thing to keep in mind. I was fascinated by the way you phrased it. You said in a world where certain disabilities were accommodated sufficiently, those disabilities would then cease to exist, which is fascinating and not talked about at all.
Well, and it only makes sense because, my eyesight in particular is not especially bad, but if it was a little bit worse at another point in history, I would potentially be considered disabled because I wouldn't be able to function or see well.
Oh, same here. I can't see shit like this far away.
Yeah.
Like without maximum contact lens strength. Like,
sure. And as technology advances, we have found very simple ways to accommodate my, personally minor restriction. And so it's not something I think of. I certainly myself don't think of as having a disability, but at another cultural moment, at another place and time, that might not be the case. And so as we develop as a society and as we, not only expand technologies, but expand access to those technologies, and it's not even just about modern technologies, of course, it's about, ramps and doors and everything else, but by creating a world in which people who have different capacities are empowered, their disability stops becoming noticeable in that same way.
What are some areas, kind of like what you were talking about, just we've made accommodations for certain kinds of differences in how we're physically built. And so we don't think about it as being a disability anymore, which kind of proves your point. What are some other things that we can be doing to just move us closer to that goal of eliminating certain things that don't need to be hard for people, but just we don't think about it as able-bodied people? That's not on our minds.
That is such a huge topic. I'm going to try to give you the biggest overarching things that I can.
Sure.
I think the first thing to do is to understand that there's a massive amount, there's just so many places where there isn't accommodation, where people think that they are offering access, where they think that the services they are offering or the building that they're making are accessible, and they are not, because they haven't consulted disabled people or people that actually specialize in this to figure out whether or not it's actually accessible, that they have these ideas. I honestly don't know where they get their ideas from, but they just decide this is what accessible looks like, and they're like, that's good. And so something I hear from my disabled friends on Twitter a lot is they say, I called the restaurant and I asked them whether they were wheelchair accessible. They said, yes, I got there. They had 2 steps at the front door.
Gosh.
Like, that's not...
Yeah.
You're right, that's not...
Yeah, there's a restaurant that my grandfather and I like, and he's not in a wheelchair. He uses a walker. And so even though there are ramps, and theoretically somebody who was in a wheelchair and was very mobile wouldn't have any trouble, but because he's in a walker, it means that I can't push him up that ramp. There's no other opportunity. And this very new building is set up such that it literally took about 20 minutes for him to get from the car into the restaurant. And that is an exhausting task for him, and something that is going to spoil his dinner in a lot of ways. I mean, just knowing, he wanted to go through it and we sat down and we ate. But then there's that thought of, okay, well, now we got to reverse this whole process. And just going out to dinner is a bit of a struggle for him physically. And so adding that on is certainly not accessible. And yet I'm, willing to imagine that this rather new building is meeting all of the official formal legislation around being accommodating.
Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, I would almost hazard to say that the majority of buildings in existence are not fully ADA compliable. And that's a common thing, that you just find buildings that just straight up aren't following the laws. And it's like, you've had 27, 28 years now to do this, and for some reason you're not. So I think one of the big things that I would say, what can we do, is start enforcing the ADA.
So there is more enforcement then. Mm-hmm. That's honestly news to me. I've always kind of felt like, oh, well, maybe this building got grandfathered in, or maybe there was some exception. I've always just sort of assumed that there was some kind of loophole that was being exploited when I see those obvious, 2 steps as you walk in the door type of issues. But to find out that likely those are in violation of the law is shocking and upsetting for me, honestly.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep. Yeah. There definitely are exceptions. There definitely are loopholes in terms of older buildings, which, you can have a debate about the value of the building versus the value of the people that use it, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
But even just within what the laws are and what the loopholes are, there is a huge amount of not following those laws. I think another big thing is lowering the threshold, lowering the level of difficulty for seeking accommodation in the workplace or in school. Both in terms of the social attitude around it, about not making it a taboo thing to be ashamed of, but also really emphasizing that that's something available, really working in good faith with, whoever it is, whether you're employing them or you're teaching them or you're managing them, to find solutions for them, to find things that work for them. A lot of that is attitude changes that have to happen so that structural changes can happen. That the structural changes are pretty difficult to use without the attitude. But that's really a big thing, that in order for jobs to be easier for disabled people to get, in order for school to be easier for them to go to at all, and then bouncing off of that, universal basic income. Because there are a lot of disabled people that cannot work no matter what accommodation you give them. It's just not a possibility, or they cannot work enough to earn a living. And so things like universal basic income, or other types of coverage so that you can, afford to live without having to work. Those are really big, important things for giving disabled people a good life and a good existence.
Yeah.
No question.
For sure.